Have you ever heard of the law of unintended consequences? Now you're probably thinking, oh, what the heck are you talking about, Jarhead? In the past, I've done videos on forest management, on forest fire, all that kind of stuff. And we're back in fire season again. We've been, knock on wood, we've been fortunate in Washington State. There really haven't been that many fires. Seems to be a little more down in Oregon, certainly a very big one down in California. And every year, you know, the fire season comes up, the smoky season comes up. And I've had people say to me things like, wow, you know, I never thought I'd live in a world where we have a smoke season. It's terrible, right? I mean, you might have even thought that if you're living in the Northwest anyway, a smoky season. Wow, we now have a smoky season. And I grew up in the Northwest and we never had a smoky season. That wasn't a thing. I don't even remember any smoky summers from, well, since I can remember into the 60s, all the way into the 90s. I don't remember any. Well, I'll tell you, when I lived in Port Alberni back in the 80s, I went to high school in Port Alberni, graduated high school there. No, I'm not from Canada. I just happened to grow up there. But I lived on Vancouver Island, and we lived out at Sprout Lake. And out on what we call Taylor Flats or Taylor Arm, which was the biggest arm of the lake, headed towards the coast, there was a huge section out there that was like miles long of hillside that had been completely burned off sometime before we moved there in the early 80s. We moved there, actually, I guess we moved there in 1980. So there had been a fire sometime in the late 60s or early 70s, maybe even the mid 70s, that had burned a huge swath of land there. But otherwise, I mean, I guess we must have had fires. There have always been fires, but I don't remember there ever being a smoky season. And now we have a smoky season. So what does that have to do with the law of unintended consequences? Well, we're going to get there. The first thing, everybody says it's global warming. Well, I'm not going to give you my thoughts on global warming. If you want to know more about my thoughts on global warming, send me a message. You can find me on Facebook. You can find my email on my About page. You could drop a comment down below. But folks, here's the thing. First of all, a smoky season in the Northwest is not a new thing. It's not. We didn't have one for some number of decades, but it is not a new thing. In fact, there are articles in papers that were written in the 1800s about the Northwest's smoky season and how bad the smoke was here in the Northwest in the 1800s. It was so bad, in fact, that there were shipwrecks because of it. Ships coming in, trying to get to, you know, Portland or Seattle, something like that, and they would run aground because they couldn't actually see where land was, because it was so bad with the smoke here in the Northwest. Who would have thunk it? How's that possible? If this smoky season is because of, well, what they say, then how did we have one 200 years ago? Because guess what? We did. Pine forests burn naturally. Actually, forests burn naturally. And depending on the forest, it could be every 3 to 5 years, every 5 to 7 years. It just depends on the forest. Maybe a little longer. It all depends on how arid it is, how dry that forest is. But a dry, arid pine forest typically will burn every 5 to 7 years naturally. So, what's the law of unintended consequences? Well, I'll tell you. The law of unintended consequences is essentially that anytime we as men try to solve a problem, typically government tries to solve the problem, then there will be a new problem created because of it. You create a law to stop one problem, but the consequences of that law cause another problem, right? So in this case, we decide that we have to fight every forest fire. We got to put them out. And we decide that we can't log. That in fact, we need to return as much land as possible to nature. What is the natural state? Well, I just mentioned it earlier. Arid pine forests burn every 5 to 7 years. Some forests every 3 to 5. That is the natural state. But we put those fires out. In fact, we started in earnest putting out fires after the big massive fire in Montana that was like in the 20s. that burned like 1 million acres in the Washington, Idaho, Montana. But there was a massive fire, killed some people. It was a terrible fire in Montana. So we decided to start fighting fires. But at that time, we had a lot of loggers. We had a logging industry. There was a robust logging industry into the 70s. In fact, when I grew up in British Columbia, logging was very robust right through to the end of the 70s. Guys could graduate high school and go to work straight in a pulp mill, a plywood mill, a sawmill, whatever, for good money right out of high school. Heck, that was in the mid-70s. You could quit high school in the 10th grade and go get a good job in a pulp mill, and the rest of your life you'd have a good career. And we didn't have massive forest fires and a smoky season. Well, a few things happened. One, we decided we were going to save critter XYZ. You know, I had a spotted owl was a big one. We're going to save those critters because clear-cut logging makes it so they don't survive. The only problem is when you clear-cut log, they actually survive better. That came out much later. We're going to save this. We're going to save that. So we shut down logging. Right, wrong, or indifferent, we shut it down. Okay? And we continued to fight fires. But the logging industry, not only did they go in and cut down a bunch of trees, which you might think of as bad, but they had a vested interest in saving the forests. Because if they ran out of logs, they ran out of work. And you might think, well, yeah, but there's so much forest, they could do it forever. Well, yeah. There was an article I read that was on a decidedly not right-leaning publication that said that if you just let the fires burn and the forests never recovered, it would take over 900 years to burn all the forests in the Northwest. That's pretty crazy. So, we shut down logging. And when we shut down logging, those companies were no longer there to maintain the roads that they had, which, by the way, those roads can act like fire breaks. They weren't logging big swaths of land, which can act like fire breaks. They weren't selective logging, which makes a healthier forest. They weren't clearing slash and underbrush, which makes a healthier forest. You see where I'm going with this? But then we took it another step. We're going to make the lands more natural. And so we went in and we cut out those roads. We plowed them up and we said, no more motorized traffic in the forests. Okay. Well, you can't get tender trucks in there to fight fires. So now it's more expensive to fight fires because you got to do it by air. We don't let the forests burn because that would be bad. And it is bad if you've done things that have caused the forest to grow thicker and thicker and unhealthier with more underbrush, more fuel, more ladders, which is fuel under a tree that allows the fire to climb up the tree into the canopy and then crown the tree, burn the tree all the way to the crown. So what happened is the unintended consequence was we now have a smoke season. We now have terrible forest fires that kill people, that destroy towns, that lay waste to our forests, that don't just burn through the underbrush and remove all of the fuel that was under the trees, but kills the trees too. Now, I don't know if you know this, but some trees, I think the lodgepole pine, but I've mentioned this in previous videos, some trees, they don't even release the seeds from their pine cones until they've burned. That's natural. So if you want to have natural forests, the first thing you got to do, let them burn. But if you've not let them burn for 50 years, which is what we've done, then you have to go in and thin them out. You got to log them. You got to remove sick trees. You got to remove the underbrush. You got to remove the fuel. You got to protect the forest. The law of unintended consequences has shown that if you take the path we took starting in the late 70s, early 80s, you end up back where we were 200 years ago with a smoky season. And the only difference is 200 years ago, forest fires were natural because they burned all the time. So they didn't have thick, dense, fuel-heavy undergrowth in the forest because it already burned off. Now, forests are thick, heavy with fuel, and once they get burning, they are hard to stop and they kill everything. And then, to make matters even worse, The DNR will say those burned trees are no good, just leave them, let them rot. Which means now you just got a dead forest with a bunch of kindling in it. And guess what? Those trees that got burned, you could cut them down and mill them up and make things out of them. I personally have milled burned trees. They make great lumber if you catch them right away. And then, since you just cleared out all of that forest that was all burned up, you now have open land where all the new trees can grow and new habitat can grow naturally. Lastly, what I'll tell you is that if you drive through certain parts of the Northwest, particularly British Columbia, you will see, or at least you used to see, and maybe they've taken the signs down now because I haven't done it in a while, but you will see signs that say planted in 1946, planted in 1954, planted in 1982, planted in 1976. Because those companies wanted to keep those forests so that they could keep harvesting the lumber. It's like gardening, only on a bigger scale. And that government insisted that they did it. So before the government shut everything down, they said, okay, Mac and Blow, you want to go log, 10,000 acres on this mountain? Okay. And when you're done, you're going to replant it. Why can't we do that? So if you want to solve the problem of these massive forest fires today, I'll tell you what you got to do. And it's just simple common sense. Even an old jarhead can figure it out. Make logging worthwhile again. Make it so that forestry companies can earn a living. Currently, they are shut down, regulated, and taxed to death to the point that sawmills shut down everywhere. Hardly anybody logs anymore. It's like you're like a pariah if you're a tree faller. The answer isn't to plow forests down and put up solar panels either, by the way. That's dumb. The answer is go in and start using more modern selective logging procedures and thin those forests out. And you could thin them out for decades. Thin them out, clean out the underbrush, replant areas if you need to cut larger sections of trees out, cut in fire breaks, natural fire breaks, as in put in a logging road that's at least 10 feet wide with good strong shoulders and culverts and things on the sides of that so that maybe it's even 15 feet wide. By the time you get through the shoulders and everything else where there's no trees, you just built a fire break, which has the added benefit of crazy people like me that have Jeeps and like to go camping in the woods can easily get to beautiful places where nobody lives. That's part of how you do that, folks. Stumpage fees, either get rid of them or make it so inexpensive for logging companies to go out and log that it's profitable for them to do so. Otherwise, they're not going to do it. And stop sending our raw logs to Japan or wherever the heck else we're sending them. We can make good lumber. This is America and, in fact, Canada. We can make the best lumber in the world. So we should not be sending raw logs anywhere. We should be sending them to our sawmills, our pulp mills, our paper mills, and milling them ourselves. And gee whiz, guess what? That would mean that some guy graduating high school tomorrow might be able to just go get a job in a sawmill. I just killed two birds with one stone, because that is also the law of unintended consequences. You save the forest by doing what you say, and the unintended consequences, you improve the economy while you're at it. Make lumber cheaper again. And the only way to make it cheaper is to make it more profitable for companies to go out and do it. And by doing that, you can save your forests. You can stop with the smoky season. Go back to the way it was when I was a kid in the 60s and the 70s, and, well, I was a young adult in the 80s, but go back to that time when we didn't have smoky seasons. Because it was hot then too, by the way. But guess what? We had companies, they were massive companies like Mac and Blow and Crown Zellerback or whoever that were out there managing the forests, because that's what they did for a living. They went out, they cut down trees, they turned them into lumber so that you could build your house, or paper so that you could read the book you wanted to read, or go to the bathroom, or, believe it or not, wood pulp is often used as a filler in things like ice cream and toothpaste. And it's a renewable resource. In the Pacific Northwest, trees grow real fast. You can actually plant trees and harvest them in a fairly short period of time. Now, short is a little subjective because it might be 40 or 50 years, but in some cases it's 20 or 30. Over there on the coast, where it rains sometimes as much as 200 inches a year, you can grow those forests back real fast, folks. So, law of unintended consequences. Forest fires are natural, but the ones we have today aren't because it's our fault because we're trying to save the XYZ animals, or we wanted the forest to be natural again, but we also didn't want them to burn, so we put them out. We ended up in a mess. And it ain't what they claim it is, folks. It's the law of unintended consequences. Well, now I'm waiting for the comments now. Listen, folks, I hope that made sense to somebody. I'm going to drop another video right here for you to check out, and I appreciate you being here, folks. You all have a great day. The old Jarhead out.